Greetings once again, all CHP listeners from all over this beautiful world. Laszlo Montgomery here with another China History Podcast episode for you. The second one in a short series that looks at the life of Morris Two-Gun Cohen. We left off last time in the 1920s with Moishe serving his master, Sun Yat-sen, as his loyal bodyguard. He was just a low-level nobody in the Sun organization, but he was part of it nonetheless and got to witness a lot of people coming and going to visit Dr. Sun. 1923 and into 1924, things were not looking promising for Sun's government. Aside from the fact that they were broke and had no tax revenue coming in, they couldn't get the support or recognition of the Western powers. The only ones showing interest in Sun were the Soviets. The Comintern sent Michael Borodin to the south of China. He began having a dialogue with Sun about Soviet support for his vision of China. And with things looking as bad as they were, and with so little international support, Sun, in early 1924, was no doubt happy to have at least one major power talking to him. This is the time when Chiang Kai-shek enters the scene. With Borodin's help, the Whampoa Military Academy was created in May 1924, and Jiang was put in charge. His number two at the academy, of course, was Zhou Enlai. As Sun's fame and reputation continued to grow around the world, Morris Cohen did his best to fuel the myth of the amazing Two-Gun Cohen. He did nothing to stop crazy rumors that exaggerated his roles and importance. He knew when to talk and when to act coy and deny certain rumors. And people who didn't know any better would further spread these stories. And Morris Cohen knew he was onto a good thing and that this whole business of being one of Sun Yat-sen's gang was going to lead to a very lucrative career. It didn't take long before word reached Edmonton and everyone learned that their hometown hero was playing a major role in Republican-era Chinese politics. One rumor was more outlandish than the next, and these rumors even made it to the streets of Edmonton, that Cohen was an important general and was put in charge of all troops under Sun's control. Moishe really began to go overboard as far as his sense of self-importance and with all his boasting and over-the-top exaggerations about his rank inside Sun's camp. He never knew when to shut up. And finally, he had gone too far, and his words and actions were starting to reflect badly on Sun Yat-sen. Someone finally had to go to Sun and whispered in his ear that Morris Cohen and his antics were making them look bad. And so, in October 1924, Sun Yat-sen gave Morris the good old pink slip, and he was dismissed. But if there was one gift Morris Cohen had, it was an ability to talk his way out of any predicament. He had been doing it his whole life with policemen, judges, gambling collectors, accusers, and now with Sun Yat-sen. He managed to talk his way back into Sun's good graces and swore on a stack of Bibles that from now on, he was going to keep his mouth shut. So he was back serving Sun, and on November 12, 1924, he accompanied Sun and his entourage up north to negotiate with the warlords about the unification of the country. But Morris Cohen never made it to the north. When he got as far as Shanghai, he was sent on a mission to Canada to assist in the procurement of weapons and ammunition. Sun went on to Beijing, arriving on the last day of the year, 1924. The father of modern China only had 3 more months to live. Morris Cohen arrived in Vancouver and proceeded to embellish the myth and preened in front of the hometown crowd about his time spent so far in China. He went ahead and self-styled himself as a general. By the time he pulled into Edmonton, he was quite a celebrity. Someone wrote of Cohen's visit, quote, "Back in Edmonton for a short visit to old friends here after more than 2 years in the storm centers of China, where he was a prominent figure in the government of the Republic, Morris Abraham Cohen, now bearing the title of General and Aide-de-Camp to President Sun Yat-sen, arrived in the city this morning." General Cohen shows little physical change since he left the city in the fall of 1922. The right-hand man of the President of the South China Republic, when seen by the Journal, was reticent in discussing conditions in the Far East, pointing out that it would be improper for him in his official position to discuss the political affairs of China. Quote, "You can say this, however," he told the Journal, "that conditions when I left were very favorable for a unification of the different political forces of the country. A conference was being arranged, and the feeling was very hopeful that it would result in success. At present, I am not in a position to give further information on the situation." End quote. He will remain in Canada about 2 months, but the diplomatic object of his visit remains a secret. The only word that comes from the lips of the envoy of the Chinese Republic is that he is here to visit old friends and to enjoy a rest after the labors of the past 2 years. End quote. Morris Cohen's meal ticket, unfortunately, wasn't long for this world, and tragically, for China perhaps, Sun Yat-sen died at just about the worst time possible. March 12th, 1925. Sun Yat-sen, he only lived for 58 years. As you could imagine, this was also quite a tragedy for Morris Cohen. He returned to China at once to assess the situation. Cohen later wrote, quote, "It was the middle of March when I heard of his death. I took the next ship for China, and on that passage I played no poker. I spent no time in a bar, and in fact, I scarcely spoke to a soul on board. I slept badly, too, and that's something that has never happened to me before or since. When I met Madame Sun, I just burst into tears. The bottom had dropped out of my world, and I still felt lost. We left Dr. Sun in the Western Hills, and for a while, I felt that I'd left the best part of myself there, too. I just mooned about and thought how empty my life was now and how little I realized my luck when he was still alive." End quote. Morris Abraham Cohen had to figure out some way to stay relevant within the KMT organization. One thing he had going for him was that anyone who knew Cohen was very well aware of his dedication and loyalty to Sun Yat-sen and the cause for which he fought for. There was never any doubt about the allegiance he showed not only for Sun and Madame Sun, but for the KMT as well. A foreigner like Cohen had his uses, and despite what many in Sun's organization felt about him and his antics, they still kept him close and continued to utilize him as an intermediary with various Western people. And Morris Cohen knew that as long as he was able to remain in the game and be a player, there were plenty more 5% commissions to be earned. The Canadians, British, and Americans weren't as easy to fool as the Chinese. They were extremely wary of Cohen and knew all about his well-deserved reputation as a braggart and exaggerator of his prominence in the KMT. One person said of Cohen he was, quote, "an uneducated, pushy Jew with a low-class accent from a poor family," end quote. And in many ways, Morris Cohen had become a caricature of himself. So Morris Cohen, feeling the negative vibes, tried to undo the damage and attempted to get that respectability that he craved so badly. So with his meal ticket, Sun Yat-sen now gone, Morris had to get on someone's payroll fast or else he'd be stuck either slumming it or perhaps even be forced to return to Canada. But thanks to the historic and game-changing turn of events and Cohen's well-known association with Sun Yat-sen and his inner circle, not to mention being in the right place at the right time, Morris Cohen's profile as the consummate insider to China politics was going to be greatly enhanced. You had, as a response to the May 30th movement, a general strike in not only Guangzhou but in Hong Kong as well. And this lasted for 16 months, from June 1925 to October 1926. You remember the May 30th incident. May 30th, 1925 in Shanghai. Troops under the British opened fire into a crowd of Chinese protesters and killed 9 and wounded many others. And among other things, this resulted in a 16-month-long strike, and a massive wedge was pounded in between the local Chinese and the foreign imperialists. This Shengang Dapagong, or Canton Hong Kong strike of 1925-26, shook the economic foundations of Hong Kong. The British government needed to bail the colony out with loans, and this May 30th movement was an early attempt by the 4-year-old Chinese Communist Party to flex their muscles and test out their efforts at organizing on a mass scale. The strike had quite an impact on Canton. It was big news, and the foreign business interests were getting clobbered. Somehow, thanks to his access to the Songs and still being close to the center of things, Morris Cohen, through his access to TV Song and Chen Yo-ren, a.k.a. Eugene Chen, was able to keep the illusion alive of his importance inside the KMT government in Canton. Eugene Chen, by the way, was a colorful character from 1920s Chinese history. He was essentially Sun Yat-sen's foreign minister and carried out diplomacy on behalf of the rival government in the South. More about him perhaps some other time. You know, even though only a gopher inside the organization, Morris Cohen was still, nonetheless, in the inner circle. And he knew all these historic names inside the KMT. He wasn't making this up. He came and went and carried messages and acted in the usual intermediary role. When the strike petered out in October 1926, Morris wrote later, quote, "I feel that my efforts in obtaining the unconditional calling off of the strike and boycott had done a little good. I might state that I was present at the conference where I had been detailed by the Chinese government to give them protection." End quote. 1926 and into 1927, Morris did much to consolidate his role as the Western intermediary of choice to the Southern leadership in general and TV Song in particular. TV Song had made Morris head of security at the new Central Bank of China in Shanghai. He was little more than an errand boy and sort of a Brinks guard, but he did take his job seriously, and these were the kinds of things he did within the Song inner circles. And because he was so close to all the action all the time, people who didn't know any better misconstrued his exact role and importance inside the organization. So word on the street was that Morris Cohen was quietly working with all the contending parties and acting in the role of go-between. Things were leading up to a crescendo, which happened, as we all know from past episodes, on April 12th, 1927. Chiang Kai-shek let loose the Shanghai Massacre and the subsequent White Terror. Song Ching-ling fled to Moscow. The KMT began to fracture, and the power centers in Nanjing, led by Chiang Kai-shek, and those in Guangzhou, who Morris Cohen was friendly with, had moved their rival government from Canton to Wuhan. And it was led for the time being by Wang Jingwei. Both sides began to start sharpening their knives. This wasn't going to be good for Morris, and now with Madame Sun out of the country and the Songs laying low, he had to go out and find a new and steadier source of income. The Suns and Songs might have liked him, but Chiang Kai-shek wasn't particularly fond of Morris Cohen. They never cozied up. Same with Madame Jiang. In early 1928, Sun Ke, Hu Hanmin, and C.C. Wu went on a world tour to drum up support for China. Who were these guys? Well, these are all characters from the 1920s and 30s. Sun Ke, well, he was Sun Yat-sen's son. And because of his father, Sun Ke was a major player in the Canton government. So was Hu Hanmin. He was a very complicated guy and one of the most powerful KMT leaders in the post-Sun era. C.C. Wu was the son of Wu Tingfang, a Qing dynasty diplomat and later a diplomat in the early Republican period. He was a very interesting person, and Wu Tingfang, in his capacity as minister to the United States at the turn of the century, did a lot to speak out against anti-immigration laws directed specifically against the Chinese. So C.C. Wu, he was a chip off the old block and also ended up as a diplomat. In the beginning of 1928, these three, with Morris Cohen in tow, started a whirlwind global tour to spread awareness about China and to get diplomatic support. And this ended up being the trip that was going to give Morris some of the importance he was pining for. Once they arrived in the UK, Morris Cohen got to visit his family briefly. First time in a long time. They had moved up to Manchester by now, and when this distinguished group from China traveled to Africa, Morris broke away. This was in March 1928, and he headed towards Zimbabwe, then called Rhodesia, to visit his sister who lived there. In one of his patented typical acts of extravagance and generosity, Morris packed up his sister and family and sent everyone first class back to England, where there was a happy reunion in the Cohen family. Morris lived lavishly and showered all his relatives with gifts and regaled them with his stories from China. After a few months' absence hanging out with the extended Cohen family, he hooked up with the group of Chinese diplomats in June 1928. They were all down in the dumps due to the tour not working out at all. They weren't getting any face wherever they went, and rather than gaining support for the nationalist government, all they got was the cold shoulder. Their last chance was going to be in England. All the disappointment up till now would be forgotten if they could only gain government support in London. Morris Cohen, in so many words, said, "Hey, leave it to me." And he rushed back to London and started using his Two-Gun Cohen ways to line up a whole string of heavyweights to meet with the delegation. Thanks to Morris, they got to rub elbows with several MPs, plus Ramsay MacDonald, David Lloyd George, and Austen Chamberlain. Austen is not the Peace in Our Time Chamberlain. That was his half-brother, Neville. Wherever the group went, they were given maximum face. And Morris, he just went along for the ride. With these nationalist leaders enjoying the recognition from the British government leaders, Morris also got to bask in their glory. By now, Morris had made sure he was referred to as General Cohen. As far as anyone knew, he wasn't a general, or even an honorary general. But Morris Cohen, he didn't allow that one inconvenient truth to stop him. He was getting a lot of shine and totally loving it. With the momentum gained from the visit to Britain, the group moved on to America next. Morris Cohen, again, did all the necessary advance work and made all the calls needed to marshal forces, so the UK and US visits went excellently. By the end of August, Morris was back in Hong Kong, and at last, he had what he believed was the respectability he was long overdue. Up till now, Morris Cohen had struggled with his own kind to get the respect and recognition he craved so badly. This U.S. and U.K. trip turned out to be a nice diplomatic coup for the nationalists, and Morris Cohen genuinely had a hand in its success. Let me read a long quote from the British Consul General about his take on Morris's 1928 trip. He said, quote, "Although he is an uneducated and simple-minded person, he takes himself very seriously as a politician in close touch with the inner intrigues and activities of his Kuomintang friends. For the past 2 years, he has regularly called on me and discussed at length on the political situation. His theme always was that the revolutionary movement in China need not necessarily be anti-British, and that the British authorities could easily capture it and oust the Russians by sympathizing with the South and giving them practical help. In other words, by allowing them to procure the arms necessary for their struggle, which they could at present only get from the Russians. I suspect that this was not disinterested advice, as he wished to act as the Chinese agent for the purchase of arms in Canada, which would have been a lucrative business. Although Cohen undoubtedly held quite an unusual place, for a foreigner, in the confidence of the Chinese authorities in the city, I imagine that they told him chiefly the things they wanted him to pass on to me, and I, of course, used him for the same purpose. Nevertheless, he has frequently given me valuable information and has on occasion been of assistance in arranging matters where the Commissioner for Foreign Affairs could do nothing. Cohen is an adventurer with a shady past, and in his endeavor to obliterate his early reputation, he is inclined to exaggerate the importance of his present position and his influence with the Canton officials. But, in spite of his Canadian record, I have not found him untruthful or untrustworthy. In fact, it is only fair to say that since I have known him, he has used such influence as he may possess with the Chinese authorities in the direction of restoring friendly relations with the British and helping British trade. This is in accordance with his own financial interests, as he earns commissions on purchases of British materials for government purposes and had ambitious projects regarding railway construction to be undertaken by Canadian contractors." End quote. Morris was able to parlay this newfound good fortune into some major bucks as an international arms broker. His next ticket to ride, if I may, was Marshal Li Jishan. Li Jishan was a very high-up military and political figure in the KMT. Chiang Kai-shek used Li as his liaison with the forces in the South. Because of who he was, Li was involved in a great deal of arms procurements. This was a license to print money, and Morris was perfectly placed to get a piece of this action. His cut was always the same, 5%. He enjoyed a whole string of successes, putting together all these arms deals for Li Jishan. The Chinese he dealt with knew Morris had a little bit of a slime factor to him. But back in those days, using guys like Morris to handle the dirty work of dealing with Western people was something many Chinese political and military men preferred. And besides, whatever everyone thought of him, it always came down to Morris Cohen's past service to Sun Yat-sen and his continued loyalty to the KMT. That still counted for something. So Morris caught another break when Li Jishan appointed him an ADC, aide-de-camp, to his headquarters in Guangzhou. All this time, Morris was also still helping out Sun Ke, talking on his behalf to more railroad contractors, but mostly he was working for Li Jishan. Not soon after he started, there was a confrontation in 1929 between Chiang Kai-shek and the new Guangxi clique, which Li Jishan was associated with. As soon as Morris Cohen started to get settled in with his new paymaster, Li Jishan got himself arrested and outmaneuvered by Chiang. So he was suddenly out of the game. And with Li Jishan out, Morris Cohen again had to go look for a new source of rice. That same year, Sun Yat-sen's new mausoleum was completed in Nanjing, and there was a grand ceremony to move the father of modern China from his temporary resting place in Beijing down to the new tomb. Out of consideration for his past loyalty to Sun, Morris Cohen was invited to be part of that whole theatrical event in May 1929. Morris Cohen later wrote of that time, quote, "I'd hoped for an invitation to the funeral, in spite of being tucked away out of sight, so to speak, down in Canton. I wasn't prepared for what actually happened. I was summoned not to Nanjing, but to go first to Beijing and accompany Dr. Sun's body, all the way from the Azure Cloud Temple. I was the only European present. I realized the extraordinary honor that was done to me, but somehow I couldn't feel pleased as I ought to have done. On that journey, there was room in my heart for nothing but sadness." End quote. So, Morris Cohen, again, not a participant in the history, nonetheless witnessed it firsthand. The next person who Morris Cohen was able to latch onto was known as the Nantian Wang himself, the heavenly king of the South, Chen Ji-tang. He did a lot for the city of Guangzhou as far as modernizing it and spiffing the place up in the early 1930s. I covered him in that 10-part Warlord History series. Again, I invite you to go check that out. Chen Ji-tang ran things in the south for Jiang. Naturally, Jiang didn't trust him, and for good reason, too. Morris Cohen himself said of his new master, quote, "A new and different part of my life began. It wasn't a very happy part either. Up till now, I'd served my chief, whoever it was, Sun Yat-sen, Sun Fo, TV Song, or Li Jishan, with my whole heart and without the thought of personal gain. With Chen Ji-tang, it wasn't quite the same. I never got close to him." End quote. It didn't take long for the warlord Chen Ji-tang and Jiang to come to loggerheads, and by April of 1931, Chen Ji-tang and Chiang Kai-shek were at each other's throats. The rival southern government now openly competed with Jiang for political control of China. In 5 months, the Mukden incident was going to go down in Manchuria, and that will add a whole new headache for Jiang, and for all of China, I suppose. I would say, right about now, considering Moishe Cohen's long life and things he saw and did, these years, 1929 and into the early 1930s, these were some of his best years. Thanks to his past reliability within the organization, Cohen was still on the payroll and served Chen Ji-tang well in procuring weapons from all over the place. If there was going to be a big military showdown between Jiang and the southern government, they figured They had better be well armed. A lot of military hardware was pouring into southern Guangdong, and Morris Cohen was getting 5% of whatever deals he was able to bring to the table. Morris had already styled himself as General Cohen for many years, and finally, in June of 1931, the competing nationalist government in the South actually bestowed on Morris Cohen the honorary rank of Brigadier General. At last, it was official. He was able to say he was a general, albeit, with an asterisk. In addition to buying arms for the Southern government, Morris also made himself useful within the Chunchi Tang organization as the usual fixer and errand boy. The business he took care of for his Guangzhou masters often took him to Hong Kong. One thing hadn't changed. Moishe's burn rate when it came to money was still as blazing as it ever was. He threw money around all over the place, just as fast as he made it. The Hong Kong establishment elites of the early 1930s were aware of Morris Cohen and regularly encountered him at one social or business function or another. And to put Morris in his place, these British elites, in their correspondence and in the newspapers, would always refer to him with quotation marks around the word general. They showed him. Morris was having a heyday, and because of the kind of work he did, he rubbed elbows regularly with all the movers and shakers in the south of China. He mixed with the military men, the political leaders, the industrial elites. He knew them all. Because he always seemed to be in the picture of whatever was going on at the time, he acquired this reputation as the ultimate man of influence, and as a wheeler-dealer, the press had a field day blowing air into this myth. And Morris, he did his thing, fueling the myths and stories using all his various tried-and-true ways. Around this time, he was even referred to in the press as the Lawrence of Arabia of China. Another paper called him the uncrowned king of China. The BS was flying all over the place as journalists bought into the sensationalist rumors, many fueled by Morris himself. Over and over he was referred to as a powerful factor in the rise of the Nationalist Party. And no kidding, in one article he was called, quote, the real president of China, whose commands are said to be obeyed implicitly by the Chinese. End quote. Our Moishe. By 1932, with Morris riding high in the saddle and flush with success, he was thinking the time was just about right to cash in on his fame and reputation. With a good portion of the population believing he was Chiang Kai-shek's right-hand man, Morris headed back to England. As before, but this time only more so, Morris arrived with the usual array of extravagant gifts for his family brought back from China. He spent lavishly on them and enjoyed another grand homecoming. I know the story of Morris Cohen that we're interested in concerns the China aspect of his life, but there was also a lot going on in the whole Cohen extended family, and I think nothing Cohen did or experienced in China could match the joy he always had in his various ad hoc homecomings. When people around town asked him what he was up to, Morris would say importantly, quote, I am now a military organizer in the Cantonese forces, acting as liaison officer between the Southern government and the foreign powers. End quote. If there was one thing Morris Cohen knew how to do, it was how to add just enough schmaltz to the words he was saying. He was more and more perceived as a major big shot in China, and for this reason, people looking to do some kind of buying or selling in China, they sought him out. Morris remained in the UK until March 1933 and traded on his name, earning plenty of 5% commissions, making intros, and working a few deals between British and Chinese buyers and sellers. Back in Hong Kong, Morris began to try to build some bridges with the Americans. He would try and make himself useful to them in a number of ways. He hosted these dinner parties all the time at his residence, which was always at the Hong Kong Hotel. That was the grand hotel of its day. It was built in 1868 and was situated right on the most choice spot on the Central Praia, the waterfront promenade. This is today where Devoe Road would be. The Hong Kong Hotel occupied the space where the Landmark and the Central Building are today. Into the 1930s, Morris Cohen lived as high on the hog as he ever did, shuttling back and forth between Shanghai, Guangzhou, and Hong Kong. always hanging out at the top hotels and clubs of the day, living large, annoying a lot of people, surely, with his self-importance. He received another booster shot when his rank in the Southern government was up to Major General in April of 1935. But things weren't going too well back in Manchester. Morris's father, Joseph, was not in good health, and the filial son rushed back to England to be with his ailing father. He got there just in time to be with Joseph Cohen for his final days, and he passed away on July 13th, 1935. Morris was at his side when the end came. He stayed in Manchester for a few months and stepped into his father's shoes as paterfamilias. He arranged for his sister Sarah's wedding, did his best to support his grieving mother, and was, as always, the big spender, taking care of all the needs and wishes of his family. And Morris remained ever vigilant, on the lookout always for any deals he could get a piece of. He didn't just sit around Manchester taking care of his family. He traveled about trying to drum up business that essentially put him in the middle between the British side and one of his many Chinese contacts. If something happened, Morris got 5% of something. If nothing happened, he got nothing. This was a line of work that required one to hustle and be useful to others. And Morris Cohen had these two qualities, and this was mostly how he made his living. He wasn't getting rich taking a salary from Chen Ji-tang's people, but working for them allowed him to establish contacts with key Chinese in the government and industry. So, if you don't mind, I'm going to make a jarring stop to this narrative, and we'll just finish things off next time in part 3 with the life of Morris Two-Gun Cohen. Thanks again to each of you. I deeply appreciate your listenership. This is Laszlo Montgomery signing off and cordially inviting you to come back next time for another exciting episode of the China History Podcast.